We're going to work with REST API and I'll explain. So the document seems really long, but it actually just have a lot of the details about the technology that we're using. Okay, so you will find that on lab 4. So we are going to look at request module instead of using the other module, the HTTP client. We are going to use Web API. So REST stands for Representational State of Transfer. This is a way that we can incorporate all the commands that we need for HTTP. It will allow your system to be able to access hypermedia. And I put the link here for you to see. And I took some of the information from the page and added to this so you can see what REST is like, or sometimes what we refer to as RESTful API. And so the 4 constraints in the uniform REST, as you can see here, is to be able to identify resources. So this allows us to be able to uniquely identify resources such as your image, your file, accounts, records, and so on. And we are able to manipulate the resource in the representation so you're able to modify your file or upload new file, change file, and so on. And it would also allow you to describe how the messaging process would be, where the client would perform a certain actions on that type of resource. Now, the hypermedia engine would require that the client application dynamically drive the resources, so it would give us interaction with what we see in HTTP. The key abstraction of REST is really to manage resource and the information that would come with the resources. So if you are uploading a file, like an image, if you're using any kind of messaging resources, you would see that REST would come to play. And we can even use REST to be able to manage your authentication. So the things that we are going to see as far as resources is going to be your data, your metadata, which is going to come in the form of response and requests, and also in the links where we would be diverting them to a different site. So it would work with the hypertext, which is what we would see with HTTP and HTTPS, and allowing us to be able to use different media type to represent the resources within a certain web page or a certain website. Now, the key areas that you need to take a look at is how you're interacting with that data. So the URL is going to be your endpoint. So whenever that you hear the reference in endpoint for web, that will be your web page or your URL to a specific web page. And so the endpoint URL is tied to resources within the API. We can have content for the page. We can also have buttons that allows the user to interact with the page, menus, options, etc. So that can be incorporated from the HTML side or other scripting technology. The methods that really work with HTTP 1.0 and 2.0 would be that you would be allowed to create, read, update, and delete. And through that, we would use the command get, put, post, and delete. So when you use get, which is what we've seen in the prior week, this is a way that we can retrieve data. And put is to replace data. So if you need to add some kind of content to a form, you would need to use put. And then if you want to create data, you would then need to post. So if I need to upload the file, that's in the form of post to that particular website. And when you remove files or remove resources, that will be delete. So delete would allow you to remove or delete the data. Now, you would use these methods through REST API to be able to modify, manipulate data, and interact with the system, ultimately your server, right, from a client standpoint. Now, on the server side, you would see that it's going to respond to different requests like what we've seen with the other modules or library. So your data payload with the request is going to include all the data that was created and modified, including your files. So, and the data is going to come back when you write your script, you're going to see that in the raw format. So in bytes, right? Unless we encode it so that way it will be in text format. And that's what we've seen in the assignments earlier this week. Your headers, that's going to contain the metadata. So that would show your requests, such as your access tokens. And in the access token, we need to also grant authorization on what kind of content that they need to access. So when you're looking at a web application like a game, right, a mobile web application, what you would see is that sometimes they would use REST API in order to incorporate our authentication token from your Google. So it would use Google Authentication API, and it would transfer your credential over. And with that credential, it would grant the access in the form of token, where it would update your certificate to show what you're allowed or what your system is allowed to do. Okay. So the content type here is going to be return, and it's always going to cache in some format. So it's going to save that based on what is authorized, especially if you're looking at authentication token. Now, in the response, that would be also how it would have the response header to your data. So when the client submit a request, right, the server needs to respond, and the client also needs to respond because there's a four-way communication. First, it needs to establish a connection. Second, it needs to serve the content. So we can take the data and we can put it into JSON, where it would allow us to use XML, and we can export that out to other applications so we can see it. So in your case, when you deal with security content for the web, you can write the script in order to evaluate the headers of your request and response and be able to see. So if we're taking a look closer to what your web traffic would be to your server, right? If we're evaluating that, we can simply use Python and write the script in order to print out, right, or export out the content to a file. So you can save that to a file and then go back and later read it, like how you would have with the logs. So the methods that you often see is going to be response content, and this is using request module. This, when you're using this method, you are going to get the raw bytes. So your data payload, right, it's going to give you your data payload, which is in bytes. Okay. Now, if you want to return string and text, you would use respond.text, and that's going to give you the string representation of your data payload. Now, not all data can be converted into text. So in the case where if you see this in the program where we're using this so that way we can visibly see, right, what that response would be. Okay. And now in the other module, like what you've seen with HTTP client, what you would have to do is you would have to encode it. So with this library, it actually does that for you at the end. So you don't have to use UTF or ISO encoding where it would actually show that. So when we're using response.json, this is simply allowing us to return it in the format in JSON, and we can save that into XML and be able to use that for other purposes. So when you're incorporating REST API with your request library in Python today, you are going to see how we are going to submit queries. So this allows us to filter the data using the API. And in the parameters, we need to put the argument, and that will append to your URL. So it really depends on your method. So if I'm simply doing a get, right, it's going to issue the get for HTTP, and it's going to return, right, the response. Sometime I want to return the status code, so I would need to put that. But we would want to include the request is handled. We need to use the argument, and your argument needs to be in as a dictionary. So keep in mind that when you do queries tying REST API with the library in Python, right, the queries is going to be dictionary. So that's what we would see in the program. So in this first program here, and if you took 30B, you've seen this before. This is the same program that I have used in 30B, but in this one, I modified it a little bit so you can actually see the header quite a bit. Okay, so 1 second, let me open that up. Okay, so here is exercise 1. And when you look at the code, let's take a look at it closer so you can see. Here is your import statement that we are going to use request module from Python. And then we are going to define the query. So in this case, we want to look at the latitude and the longitude, right, for the ISS from NASA, okay? So we would put that in your dictionary. And how do I know it's a dictionary? It uses the curly brace, and then you have the key and the value. So if we're only querying the latitude and the longitude, we can specify. So this allows us to filter down, right? Because if you don't, what will happen is the content that you're going to get back is going to be a lot. Okay, so it's like visiting the website and then you would set some kind of filter to be able to output something. Okay, so in this case, we're only going to look at 45 degrees, 180 degrees for the latitude and the longitude for the flights, because on the data, it might have a lot. And this can also apply to data analysis too, right? So if you simply wanted to look at how the server that contains this information, we can filter it down to what we want. Then we define another object called response. And here is where they're talking about the argument. So your endpoint URL is going to go here, and you want to include the extension, right, of the page. Outside of just the regular URL, which is the website itself, right, we would access the page and the file, which is the resource from the API, in order to filter down this. And the second part of the argument is going to be your parameters. So your parameters here is going to be what we want to filter. So first we have to state the endpoint. Second, we have to state what we want to filter. Okay. Now we want to use this in JSON. So we want to use the response.json, like what you've seen in the document. And we would be able to output. So the next part here is we are going to print out our headers in the request and in the response. Now, the difference between this is that when you look at the method used here, it uses the item method, but we are accessing the headers, which comes from this library. Okay. And so we want to evaluate the content of the header, which is represented in value. And since that would be a group of headers, we want to iterate or use a for loop to be able to access that. Okay. Now, if you want to do this with the exception handling, right, you would do a try and then you would have it loop. So it's going to try to get the response. So it's going to go try here. And then if, right, it is successful, if the status code is 200, then you can print these out. So I simply just run the program without exception handling, but you can implement that. So here we want to print out the request headers. And that's different than the response header in that, see how it would have the request here. So if you only going to look at the response header from the client and the server, you again would implement a for loop and we would print out the header values for the response. So when we run this program, you would see that the first part, it's going to give you, right, the metadata before it actually access your filter content. So as they would have a JSON file for the ISS on that website, then you will be able to filter that based on the content. Then here is where it would return the dictionary for what you've asked it to do. Okay. That will be your altitude because we were looking for the longitude and the latitude. Okay. So based on that, we got the content in the form of the dictionary. Then in the response, it's also going to give you the duration, the rise time for the different areas. Okay, so it's also served that. So this whole section was part of what you would see here when you print it out for JSON. Then in the next section, we are going to print our headers for the request. So it would show the user agent. We are running it through Python, not any kind of browser. So if you're using a browser at this point, right, it's going to show the user agent as browser. And that will be like Mozilla, Chrome, etc. And then it shows the encoding. It also accepts symbol because that's part of the URL. The connection, it shows you keep alive because it needs to communicate for that request. Then in the response, we would see it would put because it's coming from the server, it shows you the server platform, like what we talked about earlier this week, the timestamp, and then also the content, because we were using JSON application, that's what was served, what was responded up here from the get, the length of your content, and the connection status. Okay. So that would be simply what we implemented in exercise 1. So as you put this into your IDE, okay, and run it, take a screenshot. And here we have to describe how queries are used in the script. So as we mentioned that queries, and if you read the document that I provide, this is a way that we would filter down the data, right? Which is part of the resource on that web server. And when you specify it, you want to use dictionary as a container. Okay. So here we would include that into the parameter when we use the get method. So when it goes and fetch the content, it's going to apply the parameters that we set, which filters down the content of our data to display or output. Any question? So make sure we describe how queries are used, as I go over that with you already now. And we are going to look at the response based on what we see in our output on our IDE. We want to describe the information received from the header and the request. So when we go back to that, right, from the request, we receive the user agent, which is Python. Now, why is it not showing, right? Because it's using the library and it works with the older version. Also, it's going to accept the response, and it shows you the encoding and what it accepts and its connection status. With the response, it shows the server side. So that was from your client side, right? Then in the response, we are going to see the server side, which it gives you the platform, the content type, the length, and the connection. So with this exercise, I want to show you that you can incorporate this to evaluate your server and also what the client is seeing or requesting. Any question? So run that program, take a few screenshots, answer those questions, and they're fairly simple. Then what we want to do is part of the beginning section, it talks about how you can update your data, right? And you can also create data. And here we are going to use a different website, even though we're going to add it to the first program. Okay, so if you want to run this separately, you just have to import request and then be able to run that. Okay. So as you look at this snippet, you would see that we update the response object. And here, instead of doing the get, we would do the post. And that would make it different than what we've seen previously in exercise 1, in that we want to modify the content. And what you want to modify here is where we would have the key and the value. So your data would be represented as a dictionary when you do this. Okay, so in your argument, you would have data represented in the dictionary and your URL endpoint. And that's what basically the big section for API at the beginning, that's what it talks about. So when you're using these methods, put, get, post, right? We want to pass, right? The parameter that we're going to use is going to be the URL, but the URL, keep in mind that we want to have the extension, right? So when we do a post, it has to be post. When we do a put, it has to be put here. Or if you're getting some kind of data, it has to be where that data is stored, because it's gonna use that to locate the resource, right? Or access the resource from the server. So again, on the client side, we are going to put, and we're going to put it to this website. And here we would use the put, and then our data again is the dictionary. Now, on this one, I wanted to show you that you can print the headers, and we can just simply put date. So it would show the date for those headers. So that means that it's going to only pull, right, the date instead of other elements of the headers. So you can continue to add to exercise 1 for exercise 2. And when we run this, the beginning part is going to be part of 1. But as you look at the bottom, right, you would see that it's simply output your date. And what we did here was we used HTTP bin and we simply add the data content to that site. So we modify that and then we created it. Okay. So here it's only going to output the time. So they are ahead, okay, as it would be how it was set on their server. Question? I meant to do post here. Sorry, this should be post. So the purpose of post input, and you can come back to the first section here and it talks about that. So we can replace the data by using a put, and then we can create the data by using a post. So if you wanted to add text to a field on that page, right, or in a certain area, we can do a put and then post. And we have asked the headers to only give us the date, which includes the time. So that's how you printed out this. Okay. So in the case where if we take this into security, if you have some kind of injection, right, and you want to detect that on the server, we can simply run a script like this, and we can take a look at when those specific things were put on our server, when that request was submitted. Now, most web server would have application firewall or some form of filter system there, right? It monitors and blocks. So on those applications, you would see that it checks these things, right? So you can put in policies or criteria that the rules would be that if it sees anything that's abnormal, like an injection script, then it's going to block it. But in the absence of that, what we would also see is that, people can modify the data and also create the data this way. So creating a scripting tool to do that is fairly simple, especially for web server. So as you can see, just a few lines were able to do that, right? As long as you understand that we need to include the argument and then a certain data that we're seeking. So your URL and your data. Any question? Okay, so for 2, we simply have to answer these questions. On the next part, it touches on authentication. Okay. And for most part, we would see authentication would be different types. So if you're using some kind of authentication API like Google or Facebook, etc., right, that ties to social network accounts, or even GitHub, we would implement this by thinking about how the type of authentication is used and what are the benefits of each. So most of the APIs that you would see that will require some kind of authentication, so that way you can access that domain or that URL. Because in the case where if we're protecting data on that website, we want the user to authenticate. Rarely that you would see that user can interact with that website without authentication. So we would handle that through as a request or as request through Python. A way that we can implement this with username and password for that website, we can use HTTP basic auth. So that would be like how you would enter your username and password as it states here. So an example of this would be that if I want to authenticate, right, to GitHub, I would first use the get method. And then again, we would put in the URL. And here we want to include the extension, right, the user. And we would define what this object would hold, which is going to be your basic authentication in HTTP. And the parameter of that will be username and password. So it's like opening the browser and typing your username and password. So these are the 3 lines. Now, we would use access token to securely implement the authentication. So this would act as your username and password. And we can also get that token. So again, we're going to come back to looking at that token by doing a request get in your URL. But notice that here we're going to look at the headers. So what are the 3 main authentication mechanisms, right? We talked about the basic authentication. This is for the encoding where the user would like typing in username and password. And for Apache, it's going to use Apache directives, and it uses the HTTP password utility. So if the basic authentication is used with Apache, this is the utility, and it would use the standard Apache directives. And that can be varied, right? Many of the servers that are available are Linux servers, and the majority of the time you would see that they implemented Apache. So with that method, we would then be able to obtain the credential of the user by sniffing it. And that would be plain text. So Michelle asked, can I use this request to get the method retrieve files from personal account on GitHub? No, because GitHub uses a different form. So when you try the script next, you're gonna see, okay? But if a website that's using a non-encrypted, storage of passwords, then you can use the basic auth mechanism. Okay, so if they're storing it in plain text, right, we can sniff it out with Wireshark, and we would then see it like this. So you can probe it by running the script, and if it's respond, then you can sniff out the password instead of brute forcing it. Okay. So that will be a two-step process, right? The assessment in application for web is that you have to implement different tools in order to get from one step to another. And we would assume that it only uses username and password, which the majority does. So on the browser side here, it talks about how when you do the basic authentication, right, that would be from the client. So you open up the browser, you visit the website, you enter the username and password. All of this is going to have the authenticate tag and the protected domain name. Now, there are additional third-party tools that supports HTTP basic auth. Okay. So you can implement those tools in order to use that in your script. So now if you run this example, okay, so let's read the script first. We import the library, which is request. And from that library, we are particularly interested in using just authentication. So from this package, we're going to have used this module, and we're going to import in this class, HTTP basic auth. And we're going to get pass. We're going to use get pass. So if the user store that password in then the account, then it should be able to generate it if it's implementing your basic authentication. If they're storing password in plain text or your account in plain text information. So we want to first create the username that's going to be the user input. So the user going to enter the username. And for the password, it's going to store get pass. Now for the response, we are going to do a request get because it needs to get in order to give you the response as the output. And your parameter would include, of course, right, your website with the user extension. For authentication, since we brought that in here, we need to implement the class. So it becomes here you instantiate the class object. So HTTP basic auth, and we would have username and password. And after that, we would print out the status code. So if we successfully connect to it, right, it would give you the response in string, in text, which is what we saw earlier in the document. Any question? So, right, this is my user account. And notice that when I enter that, because that is a real GitHub username. So would I get an error from this script with two-step verification? Yes. Yes, it would. Or sometime it will be pending like this, Michelle, because it will never return, okay, to this. You're welcome. So you're unable to, it's not able to obtain your credential, right? Because it's two-step, or in the case if it's encrypted, then we will not be able to pass it over to the next step so it can output. Okay. So in the case where if it's not able to access the password because it's either encrypted or it requires multiple level, then we would not be able to get to the next part of our program, which is, log in after it does the get. Question. So here, what this shows you is that even though, right, we write this script and then we implemented the basic auth mechanism for the script, if the site doesn't use that, right, we're unsuccessful in connecting to it. Okay. And also sometimes they block script too. So in the case where if the host, when they're hosting it, the server that hosts it, they could be blocking script coming in. Okay. But the procedure in this, the algorithm for this particular script is really what is it? It's like typing in your username and password or retrieving it to be able to plug that in so you can log in. Right? So if it's stored and if it's able to see it, it will be able to pass it over to the site and then plug that in for you, like how you save your password to the system and it plugs that in. What if the two-step authentication was accidentally pressed by the user? And if your password is plain text, this would work, Cynthia. But in most cases now, right, in the case of GitHub, it is not. Okay. So, but let's say that if it's in plain text, it's going to then be able to plug that in here. See how that plugs in here. So, many like how we would cache it to the system and we use an application like Microsoft or GetPass is the application, right? And it plugs it in for you. Then, but you have to authorize those apps to be able to talk to another app. See? So in that, you give it the privilege to plug that in. And in our case, we're using plain text, so it's not able to do that. You're welcome. Then on the next one, there is another mechanism, which is called the digest authentication. This is using MD5 to encrypt the user key and the hashes. So as you know that there are many forms of encryption that we can implement in authentication. So how we protect the password is essential, right? So the technology that we would use, and so MD5 is not exactly the highest either, okay? But it is used in some web services. So if the host is implementing this, we can also use HTTP digest authentication. And here it tells you that this is going to be the extension to what you've seen with the basic. It uses a one-way hashing MD5. And that would give it a unique value for the connection. So when the client browser uses this, it would apply the formula to calculate the password for the hash format. So on the website that uses MD5 hash to protect the password, this mechanism won't work. Okay. So here, a good tip is that it tells you here that if the password is obfuscated, then the crypto hash is then use a unique value, which prevents the replay attack. So if you elevate it from plain text to encrypted password for the web with just hashing, right? it does prevent some form of attack, which is replay. Because in replay, all you need to do is scan with Wireshark, right? And you would read the vector and you would be able to see, right, plain text information. And that's how you're able to obtain it. Now, if you hash it, when you scan it, you will not see that, okay, in plain text. So at this point, they would have to either find ways to be able to get, right, the password from the hash key. Any question regarding digest authentication? So I put it up here because I didn't want it to get cut off, but as you write number 4 program and run it, okay? And you can try to see if you can test it with a real account. Now, if you visit the site, let me copy the URL so I can show you, okay? If you do this entire URL, okay, it prompts you this, right? And so the user would then need to putting in the password. So the way that they created it is these extension just represent the user account and the password. But if you visit just the website on its own, right, it simply is this. It's just a bin where for HTTP development. Okay. There's no registration, there's no, so the developers that work on this, they would have access to it. So the whole point is not just to test this website, but you can see if you can test other websites, okay? With permission. We wanted to do it ethically. Okay, so what you need to put here is the entire endpoint URL where that would tie you to the user and the password. Okay. And then, so with that, because we declare what that URL is here, it simply goes into the parameter. So if you don't create a variable to hold that, you need to type that in here. Okay. And for your authentication, you just need to specify that this is now a different class, right? Because just like the basic one, you have to bring in, okay, the auth request, and then you are going to import in the class where you will now create a class object or instantiate the class object here. Okay, good. I guess they updated the 1, 2, 3 and password should be password. It used to be blank, but yeah, I guess they fixed the issue with that. So that's how you can also obtain information like passwords. Now keep in mind that not all are using the same technology, okay? So when we test web servers, there could be vary. So understanding like how to implement this in different type is important. So this kind of show you how you can work with the API. Okay. In this one too, we also have it print out, you know, your header values. So similar to what we've seen in the first exercise, right? We use a for loop. We iterate through and we print out the headers value. That will be your metadata. And then we also print out the status to see if it's connecting. So if it is connecting, okay, then we would show that it's login successful, and we would show the header response. Any question on this? So this is what you see is another mechanism for authentication with web, right? This one uses hash. The first one, just plain text. And then I don't have a program for the bear authentication because usually you would use also additional tool, like a third-party tool or something like that. Okay. But I put a link for tutorial if you wanted to attempt to go through the steps to do that, you can. Okay. And it uses the token from here. And so that's a little bit different. So a lot of the time you would see the bearer authentication. This is used for access token and it uses OAuth. So you have to implement OAuth into your script. Okay, so if you see this, let me open this up. And you can also read their documentation as well. Okay, so it shows you how you can use see how it uses OAuth. Okay. And so you can implement SHA and so on. So if you want, you can walk through the steps. Now, if you look at the tutorial, there's a section where it grants access. And that's what the token really does with the API on what type of things you want the account to do. So you would then need to be able to implement that. Okay. So when you use this, notice that, look, this is all the things that you need to bring in, right? We talked about the parse lib. You also need to use base 64. So these are the additional library. You need to have a hash lib and so on. And then you would have to define the functions or the method in order to get key and access key and store that key. So that way you can get that authentication credential. I think that the majority of what we've seen in a lot of our web applications is using this, right? And no, you can have a template of this and be able to integrate that with, assessment. So that will be the third type. Any question regarding API and authentication that we have transitioned from just looking at response headers and request module over to applying the authentication? Okay, no questions. So on the last part, and I want to tie this back, and this was covered in the text. I didn't get a chance to hit this section last time. So we will talk about httpx. And this is another library that you can use with Python 3 for the HTTP client. And it provides sync and async API for 1.1 and HTTP 2. So if you read their documentation, it basically allows you to utilize or implement requests for API, very similar to the other ones, but it would work for the synchronous interface and asynchronous. Okay. And as you would have website that would have synchronous and asynchronous, this is a good module to know. So when you look at the script, very short, we simply import in the module, and it also support, all your basic get, put, post, etc. So if our request is going to be this, since we simply use the get method and we can pass the endpoint URL here, we can print out the request, we can print out the status code, and then we can print out the headers. So it's going to give you similar to what you've seen in the other modules, right? We can achieve the same thing where it should show you whether you connect or not and what was served to you from the server and what was being requested. So here we see that our response is going to be okay. So we probably don't need to have this next line. So if you're simply doing a get, right, basically you're visiting that site and it's going to give you the response back. Now here, a little different than the other one in that earlier you saw that when we're using requests at the beginning, we have to implement, you can put in the queries as a dictionary. And then if you're using other modules like HTTP client or URL lib, right, you have to take the raw data and convert it back and show what type of, with the specific encoding. With this, it tells you the type of header because we specified the content type. So as you use this, you have to look at what httpx allows as far as what you can filter for your headers. So if I'm only looking for content type, I need to specify that here. And that is a list. And I want to print that. So here it shows me that it is HTML, and for the encoding is ISO. And we can do more with this, like the other one where we can look at values and so on, right? But at the simplest level, you would see httpx being used like this. So it is another module that you can use to examine communication between client and server. And that's what we've been looking at in this particular chapter. Any questions? So I see a chat. Yes. Yes, that is correct, Cynthia. So we are, when we're using API, right, it's just another way to interact, because when we're writing an application, we got to connect it. So yes, that is correct. An application on top of an application. That's what the API is designed to do. But REST API is specifically allowing you to interact with the content or resources. Okay, that's the key for REST, is to utilize resources. And whether it's serving you the HTML by doing get, right, or it's gonna give you additional information that you need. So you can still achieve this by just running, script with other libraries like what you've seen in the assignment. But for authentication, we want to integrate API. Okay. It's a way that we can interface with the actual application, a web application. So for 5, after you run that, provide a screenshot, you would describe to me, right, how is this different or similar to what you've seen with the other modules and packages, how the request and the response is being handled, right? We see similarity in our methods like get. We also see that you can print out status code, so that is implemented across, right, request or httpx. Now the key difference in httpx is when you're working with SYN, right? We would implement httpx, sync and async. Any question? So the only example that there are many long examples from the text, and if you have access to their source code, you can check them out and look at those programs. I highly recommend it. There are, from the lecture itself, I did not include like obtain images, but you've seen how files are being pulled. And I think we did one with in our assignment where we would go and get the image. So similar to that, but they expanded on it to really look at the image headers and things like that. In the HTTPX portion, it talks about it. And then for the API, you would see that the way the author wrote it, there's 2 long programs that he used, and it pulls together all of the, the details that we touch on throughout the exercise, like the request, the response, and so on. Okay. So what I wanted to do was I wanted to chunk it into smaller programs. So as I understand that we're new at this, so we have to be able to understand it. But definitely the book does a good job with explaining, right, pieces of it and how the program is using these libraries or modules and the specifics. So if you have the text, you can read it, you can refer to it. You can also look at the source code and test it out. Okay, which is slightly different than what I have displayed here with the lab. And I try to make it where we would cover, right, the majority of it or all of it. Okay, any question? See a chat. Okay, so you have a question for number 5 from Monday. Okay, so there was a comment. So companies use API for transfer data. That data can contain sensitive information. Yes. So they can do that. They can do batch. They can do a lot of different things. So all of these transactions or processes that is implemented for web, either commerce or whatever it is that they need to fulfill, it's written in the form of applications, right? So in that we need to really protect the data content. So these applications need to talk to other applications. And ultimately, when you're using the web server, your interface with an application. Number one, your authentication application, right? Where you would enter your username and password. And so the client would use an application to access the web, which could also be another application. So APIs are simply just a way to integrate interfaces across these applications. So when you're dealing with sensitive data, that can be used to pull, but a lot of times database uses application on its own. So when you communicate, between different areas of your website, right, that would just be integrated as application. And yes, we would use this to connect them together. So in the case of single sign-on, you can apparently see this, right? So I have Canvas as a learning management system, but to access Canvas, right, I interface with it as a form of application. So and if I want to bring in other tools on Canvas, I would use the API, right? Like for example, Practice Lab is another a web application that allows you to access the lab content. Or if I'm integrating some, so I can embed things that are pulled from other applications like YouTube or Practice Lab. I just have to authorize one application to access the other, and the extent in the data from the other application. So if I authorize it to access everything, then it's able to pull all the data, but I want to shield some of the data, then I need to control that. So, and that's how we are able to incorporate all these other elements outside of our own features and content for our web. Other questions? So Michelle had a question for number 5. So let me go to my folder and pull up assignment. Okay. You're welcome. Okay. Which one is it, Michelle? You said number 5, or is it example 5? This one, question 8. Oh, I'm looking at 3. I'm sorry. It's been a long day. All right. I'm like, why is it not the same? Okay, number 5. Got it. Okay, so we're using example 2, ULib request package, and then ULib parse. We do the post data and the pin post and display in the response. Okay, so here, let's go find number 5. Yeah, so we're using, for assignment number 5, we use the URL lib request and parse. And here you also have a dictionary. So you're going to post this, okay, to Pastebin. And so, but before we post, we want to encode it, okay, because the system has to take your human text and then convert it to what we're seeing. So are we to see the data dictionary variable output, or just the container which uses the dictionary format? It should bring in the dictionary. Okay. Yeah, so when you look at this, if you look at the details here, when it outputs, a lot. So all of these are just like the content from the actual site, and that will be your HTML. So the post here simply is that we would put this into, you know, the paste bin. It's like you put that into that text box for paste bin. So the response that you get is just going to be what the server is serving you, right? And here is where we think about, like, what we just done right now is we should filter it down to lessen this, because they implemented a lot of different things. Oh, I think I missed the post section. I just saw it. Yeah. So it's gonna give you, see, that is part of what it was integrated. So in this, it's gonna accept the post form, but this is also in JavaScript and HTML. Okay. So you would see the method post and then the data. Okay. So this data is then encoded and post. So coming back to your question, yes, the value CIS, this part, 33 test. Is it blocking now? Let's try it. Let's see if it's gonna update it. Yeah, it's not giving you the, it should decode it and read it. Let me see, Cloudflare, mirror and script vendor. No, I don't want to see that. It shows you here. One second. Yeah, you don't see, you're not gonna see this part. I think it posted the container. I gotta dig through this real quick and try to find out what it did with the form. It serves the content fine, just like how it would display for that. Let me look at their mechanism on here. Yeah, so it puts all of these image, the cookies, Yeah, so, okay, I see why now. So this section right here is a form of new paste, okay? So when you post, all that is you are creating a piece of data, which is the dictionary on the site. It doesn't necessarily display because it's not in HTML, so this piece right here is going to be added to this in the back, okay? And so when we decode this, it's just a text data comes from a dictionary that's there. Now, it's not going to display here because, right, it has to convert it to HTML in order for you to see something here. And we didn't have all of that. So when you look at this, what it's saying is that it's responding to what you have created, okay, for your data, okay? But we are not displaying that data on the web page itself. We simply create it, and we also didn't tie it to that particular page. So that's why you don't see anything on this. So will it display in the develop? Yes. On the server end, it should be able to see that. And we see the response from the server. Okay. And so here, when they write it in JavaScript, so if you want to display something, you can simply have to, incorporate JavaScript with this in order for it to really output anything for the user to see, for the client end. So when the server serves it back, right, it needs to take that and say, okay, it's going to embed it into here as a string and be able to see that. But on the server side, on the back side, it should show that you created that piece of data called CIS30C on this page. Other questions? I hope that's clear. So the value test is in the backend, yes. So when you post and put, you simply update data or create data. Now, if you're using like the HTTP bin, you might be able to because the website that they use in the book, it shows you that it's a development website, a test website for HTTP. So you might be able to see something, on the screen where it shows put and paste or put and get and so on. But as far as Pastebin is just a space where I can copy and paste real quick. And it puts it on the cloud temporary and I can pull it. But all of the front stuff is in JavaScript and HTML. So we have to, if you want to bring it to the front, you have to make sure that it is scripted to show the user on the interface. Yeah, so all of this is happening with the back end. Other questions? On the next chapter, it goes into onion router and various things. You mentioned that parse makes a container. Is there other stuff in the container besides test? No. So what you put here, what you specify in here, because we parse it as a dictionary in and we encode it in ASCII, that would be only where it stores the data. So when I say create a container, all that is it sets a memory location on that server, right, for the test value. You're welcome. So can someone put things on your server? Sure, right? Like what we talked about before. And in the case where if it can be accessible, we can add or update data if that's authorized, right? Then you definitely someone can put something on your server intentionally. Okay. Other questions? And so when you look at the output for number 5 on that, you should take a look at what's the access control on that, right? So from the security side, we need to really tighten this part right here. And then on how it's requiring cookies and things like that. Would adding to the server be as simple as making? Yes. But this is why I asked this question right here. So when you're getting the response back from the server, you need to take a look at how they're controlling the access on that, right? If it's wide open, you're not gonna, I mean, yeah, it would just be putting some piece of data on there. But a lot of the times you're gonna see that they control that, okay? It might time out and not put anything because because you don't have the privilege to do that, right? Like developers. So if you don't authenticate and you try to submit something, it might kick it out. So that's the job. If they set the control and access control list, it's the job of the filter system to not put it into the server or not allow that request to, even if it goes through, it's not going to add any kind of content. But if you just have something that it's not protected, it's not secure, it's not controlled, then yeah, simply is a post or put. So when we input things on forms and things like that, that's allowable for that user account on that page, right? And as you type, they program it so that way you can, when you click submit, you can see some kind of summary because it's already been, coded to really show you what you type. But that piece of information would be transferred to a location or, so your data, your raw data in bytes, right? 200 megabytes to whatever size that is, that needs to be transferred to a location where it needs to encode it and put it into a database, which, another side of your backend. And then when I asked the part for the cookies, right, if you go through and you look, and when you visit the site, you also have a general idea on how the interface is looking and what it's really doing when it's serving this back. Okay. So it's asking to store cookies is used to potentially right here, right? There's cookie policy, there's cookie button, which allows you to click OK, I understand. But as I don't do that, right, it's not going to store the cookie. So what they create here is they would do it for analytics so they basically use it for marketing purposes and so on. The ads that you see on that site when you visit it again. So, and that will be customized to the user experience because if you store the cookies, it might study your or it might collect your browser behavior and so on. And with that, it will present you with the appropriate advertisement or images that will relate to the advertisement on the page. Okay. So, and as I don't click yes, it's not going to store anything. So this is an event-driven portion, right, of that. And this, you can see that it's a pop-up container. So if I do go back to this site, right, this part right here is what we're looking at. So if I click OK to understand it, that event is activated, and then it would then create a cookie file. So my recommendation is above Python or besides Python, you should learn JavaScript and JS Node. Okay, because JavaScript is abundantly used, as you can see in this one, for most of the web stuff and data analytics stuff too. Okay, so that, you know, not just from a developer standpoint, but also assessment. Okay, having JavaScript knowledge is also useful. Understanding what is used to create and you know, from Python going to JavaScript, really easy, very similar. Okay, so if you have already programming background, it's easy. Other questions? Okay, so everything is going to be due on Sunday. And it's okay if you can't submit it on Sunday. I usually don't dock points if it's like a day or two late. But if it's like 6-7 days late, then it will just be based on my policy for late assignments. Okay. So let me start recording.